Welcome, everybody. This is our 7th Under the Dome session, and we're really pleased to have our Textile Executive Director, James Bass, with us today. I do want to remind everybody to switch to speaker view. That provides you with the most optimal viewing experience during our program. I do want to take a minute to thank our sponsors for this series. They are H&TB, EHRA, the Goodman Corporation, and Memorial Hermann Hospital System. We really appreciate their support. This series has been really critical to stay connected, and so we really appreciate their sponsorships. We'd also like to thank our mobility partners for 2021. They support us throughout the year for all of our programs and all of our advocacy, and we really appreciate that as well. I do want to invite everybody to ask questions throughout the program. You can message me directly in the chat box, and I will make sure that your question gets answered. I can ask it for you, or you can ask it yourself. Just let me know. With that, I am going to go ahead and introduce our guest today, Textile Executive Director James Bass. He has been with Textile since 1985. I had to look that up just to be sure. I knew it was a long time. I think it was in 2015, correct me if I'm wrong, that you were appointed Executive Director. And I think from my lens, I always appreciate that you always have very detailed answers. You're honest, you're transparent, you are very approachable. You've always been really willing to have a great conversation and answer even really the really hard questions. And so really appreciate that. I know that you are in your current role until I just found out at the very end of session, which the regular session was clarified. So yes. Thank you for that, because we could be in this for a while. You know, we're so delighted, and we want to say congratulations on the next chapter. But while we still have you in this role, we're really fortunate to have a lot more conversations about session and what's going on with TxDOT. So with that, I'm going to let you take it away.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I was selected as executive director in 2015, but I began officially in 2016, and I made an executive decision to give all TxDOT employees the day off on the day of my anniversary as becoming executive director. And so every January 1, TxDOT workers have off, as do all other state agency employees. But
well done.
To say the least, February has been challenging for all Texans, as we all know. And just last week, all 254 counties were under a winter weather advisory. I do want to talk just briefly, and I know that was a very challenging week, and I hope everybody is safe and has recovered from the events of last week. But 2020 was also a challenging year, and I know we visited back in September. And 2020 was challenging in a number of different ways, but one of the ways it was challenging is traffic safety. And so we were hoping, thinking that some of our traffic safety figures might have actually improved because of the pandemic and people not moving around as much. So we were really surprised to see the number of fatalities on Texas roads increase for the year 2020 to 3,906. And that is the highest number since the year before I began at TxDOT. So the last time we had more than 3,906 was back in 1984, and that was 3,913. And so some of the things that, you know, our numbers are likely to increase even for 2020, even though we're past the year. And that's simply because some of the reports that we get from law enforcement may come in or be delayed. And so we'll continue to update that figure. But that's, you know, one of the reasons I hope everybody on this call is familiar with our In the Street campaign. We believe traffic safety is a shared responsibility. We, as your Department of Transportation, have a lot to do with that in our design and maintenance. Our law enforcement partners play a role, but so do each and every one of us every time we get behind the wheel. And so just making sure that we are courteous and focused on the driving task at hand can, and always wear a seatbelt can help us reduce the number of fatalities. I thought I'd go through maybe some statistics from last week's winter storm event, and then at the end I'll compare it to another weather event that we're all too familiar with, and that would be Hurricane Harvey. But as I mentioned before, every county in the state was impacted, and our folks were out there working 12-hour shifts, 24 hours a day. We had a few sections that were going on that 24-hour day routine for 12, 13 days in a row. So they were doing it for quite a long time. At the end of it all, we had more than 6,000 employees show up at different points of that time to be a part of our response to the state. And if you were looking at drivetexas.org over the event, you saw that I think nearly 6,000 different roadway sections at one point or another were affected by snow or ice. We actually had 70 different roadways that were closed. We also assisted in clearing, maintaining routes to critical infrastructure facilities like water and power plants in order to maintain fuel delivery, to hopefully be able to keep that power generation going and the delivery. And obviously I know there were challenges, and that's one of the things that our Textile employees are just like everybody else. A lot of them lost power and lost water at home, but they kept coming in to work and getting out on the road and helping to clear things and keep them going. We also provided fuel to the Department of Public Safety, Parks and Wildlife, the Animal Health Commission. We assisted in escorting oxygen tankers to area hospitals, making sure that they had a clear path to get there. And yes, we even helped HEB and FEMA. We went to some of their distribution centers and a FEMA warehouse to make sure that they were able to get the movement of groceries and water, get them from their facility out onto the state highway system so they could start making those deliveries. So, obviously I'm very proud, as I always have been, of the response of TxDOT. It's one of the things I love and will greatly miss, is just kind of that servant mode, if you will, of TxDOT employees who really kind of show up whenever there's a challenge within the state to kind of look at it and say, what can we do to be helpful, and then to get to work on it. One of the things I mentioned was drivetexas.org, and of course one of the largest utilizations of that tool that we saw was back in Hurricane Harvey. Back in Hurricane Harvey, we saw more than 5.1 million visits to that drivetexas.org. And this last week, we saw over 3.6 million. So not as much as Hurricane Harvey, but still a large volume going to that website. And then to our 1-800 number, for those people who may not have access to the internet, we do have an 800 number, 800-452-9292. And Harvey, we had 168,000 calls. And then for this winter storm, we had just under 97,000. And speaking of another 800 number, this came up during the winter event. And so if your audience does not know this, on the back of your Texas driver's license, there is a road assistance number that if you ever find yourself stranded on the side of the road, just pull out your driver's license and look at the back of it. And it's on there. It's 1-800-525-5555. But the main thing is just to remember, pull it up, pull out your driver's license, look on the back if you're ever in need of that. And there were, I think, a lot of people who were not aware that that resource was there and available to them. Also going on is the legislative session, and it's really starting to pick up a little bit with the different hearings. We provided some testimony earlier this week to House Appropriations, and it was really kind of a general overview of the different funding streams or funding elements that come into the department. And then next week, we're before the subcommittee on House Appropriations that's looking delving a little bit deeper into our budget request. Senate Finance will be meeting on Tuesday. And again, their focus will be on our legislative appropriations request. And then we may have an opportunity to present to the House Transportation Committee next week, focused on our winter weather response from recently. Speaking of funding, and then maybe I'll open it up to questions, but I know when we spoke back in September, there's been a lot of news on the funding front, I would say. And so one of the things that we've done is we've looked at a forecast of our revenue over a 4-year period from 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023. For that 4-year period, we looked at a forecast before the pandemic to our revenue and then after the pandemic. And so if we focus just on our traditional revenue sources, and that would be really the state motor fuels tax and vehicle registration fees, we saw a projected decline from those revenues over that 4-year period of just over $1 billion. It's actually $1.014 billion. The good news since we last spoke in September is that Congress passed legislation in December where they allocated $10 billion to go out to the state DOTs. In Texas, we received $967.7 million of that. So that $967 million doesn't completely cover the projected loss over this 4-year period, but it comes pretty darn close to covering that. So today, we appear to be in a much better financial situation than we were, when we probably talked in September. We and other DOTs are trying to be careful and not refer to this $967 million as stimulus money. It's really recovery money. It's just kind of going to fill in that hole. And again, it doesn't fill it completely, but pretty darn close. So we're obviously thankful for that and looking forward to kind of keeping our plans that we had in place and being able to continue to move those projects forward and deliver on those. So then if we look at Prop 1, and as those that have been following along, we all know that Prop 1 is volatile. The first year of deposits, we received $1.7 billion, and then 2 years later, it was $440 million. So there can be big swings in that revenue source. And so again, if we look over that 4-year period, the projection is, the current projection is around $1 billion less than it was before the pandemic. But again, we treat that revenue source differently and we manage it differently than we do our traditional sources because of that uncertainty and volatility. The last one I'll talk about is Prop 7. There's roughly a $220 million projected decrease in that revenue stream, and that's really from the second phase of Prop 1. So the $2.5 billion of state sales tax between $28 billion and $30.5 seems to be, in place and not at risk of not meeting that threshold. But the second phase was any revenue that came in from the motor vehicle sales tax and rental tax above $5 billion, 35% would come to the highway fund. And it appears that it may take a little bit longer to get to that threshold before the highway fund starts to see any of that funding. And then in our LAR, our legislative appropriations request, which we're beginning to have those discussions with the different committees in the legislature. One of the things we're hoping to be able to get or have discussions on is perhaps some additional FTEs. We may have talked about this before, but way back in 2010, 2011, when our commission looked at our 10-year planning document, we were running to the end of our bonding programs. And so if you looked at the second half of that 10-year program, it was really dropping off the table, if you will, because we didn't know how those projects would be funded. So our commission looked at that, and I think prudently at the time, given what the information they had available, they ended up over I guess, 2 different biennial cycles, turning back in around 2,000 FTEs, because it's like, well, if we don't have the workload, we're not going to need all these extra people. Well, of course, right after we did that, a couple of years later, along came Prop 1, quickly followed by Prop 7. And so that 10-year document doubled. And so now we feel like we need some of those people back. We're very thankful the legislature over the last 2 bienniums has provided us 627 to kind of, go towards that reduction of 2,000. And this time we're asking for another 281.
Okay, very good.
And I think I'll pause at this point and see if there's any questions. If not, I can delve into maybe some pieces of legislation that have been filed, but I'll pause and see if we have questions.
We will certainly ask you about some of the legislation. I know our chairman, Mustafa Tamiz, is on, and there are some other questions, but I'm gonna let him make a comment or ask a question. Oh, let me get you unmuted there.
First, I just wanted to thank you for your service and your leadership over the years. That large agencies function because there's strong leadership and there's people that know the details, and you've always not only had the reputation, but you've demonstrated it in committee hearings that we've seen you over the years. There's one thing you mentioned that I want to offer TAG to help if there's a need for this. We work with the Public Works Department in Houston, recognizing a lot of the maintainers. You mentioned that even before the FEMA or HEB could get out there, somebody had to go clear the road. Somebody had to make it safe for the people that are sometimes first responders. And people who do that work often just don't get recognized. And we love to kind of partner with you, whether it's, across there, really at least in our region, to try to recognize those individuals, because we often talk about our first responders, which are very important, but the people that make the safe for the first responders never get mentioned. And so love to partner with you at any kind of internal program that you might have on that.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And the, speaking about testimony, I've always appreciated that it's an open book exam, right? So I can take in a binder full of information along with me and hopefully navigate through it. And I'm able to do that because we have a great team at Textile, right, that, prepares me and comes up with off the wall questions like they're never going to ask that. And then of course, a few hours later, here it comes. Yeah.
I tell my kids that the open book exams are usually harder because you have to know where to look.
Well, any legislative hearing is going to be tough, right? But yeah, being able to look up and kind of check that memory with material is always helpful. And yeah, we have a great team really across the state. But I agree and appreciate your thoughts. One thing I would say at our commission meeting earlier today, Commissioner Ryan, after Hurricane Harvey, she kind of gifted us with the Grit Award, showing perseverance and the get her done attitude of a lot of folks at TxDOT. And we've kind of moved it around over the years. Well, today she awarded it to really our maintenance and our frontline workers all across the state. I think our TxDOT, I'm sure it's on Facebook, but I know our TxDOT Twitter handle had a tweet out about that, showing the individual that received it on behalf of all of our frontline workers. And yeah, we are very proud of them. And that was the message during this event is, stay home. We're out there clearing the roads, but we're really clearing them for those first responders. So, everybody else, please stay home if at all possible.
Yes, thank you, Mustafa. And I think continued recognition and anything that we can do too externally to really showcase that is super important. I know we had our State of TxDOT after Harvey, and we had a bit of that recognition, but certainly it's continued through the pandemic and with winter storms. And I don't want to think about anything else that's ahead right now. I think that's enough.
Yeah, I was talking to Nim Kidd, who you may have seen. He's the head of the Division of Emergency Management. And with my pending retirement coming up, I told him, I said, well, you may actually be happy for me to go, because during my tenure, we've had Hurricane Harvey, we had this winter event. And so I'm not sure if I've been bad luck, perhaps.
I don't know. So I'm going to dive right into some of the questions. This week was I think it was what was last week was supposed to be in many cases, because all the big bills got filed this week or starting to get filed. And they're kind of coming in, and I guess if this is what you do, it feels a little bit like Christmas, because I'm sorting through everything and checking everything. There was quite a few that came from the House Transportation Chairman Canales this week. One of them dealt with the Texas Mobility Fund. And I know that TxDOT is not always in a position to advocate, right, for certain pieces of legislation, but I think it's really helpful if you can kind of articulate what that means for TxDOT should something like that pass, and some of the history that's related to that mobility fund and having access to those funds and what that means for TxDOT.
Yeah, so the Mobility Fund was initially approved by voters back in 2001 through a
Right.
constitutional amendment. Then in 2003, the legislature kind of laid out revenues to be dedicated to it. So the whole design of the Mobility Fund was for the purpose to issue debt and then take those dedicated revenues to pay them back over time. A few years ago, the legislature, I think, started to have a concern that the amount of bonds outstanding were continuing to grow. So they kind of called a timeout, if you will, and they kind of suspended the authority to issue more debt. Now, they didn't remove the authority from statute to do it. They just kind of placed in a timeout provision, if you will, right? With no sunset date on that timeout.
Right.
So now they're coming back in, sounds like through this legislation, maybe hoping to have another dialogue on that. I think our latest estimates, and I think this was in some earlier reports. So on some of these, we need to finish our analysis and then make sure the legislative process knows what our analysis is. But I think on this one, there was also some information included in some interim reports. And so our current estimate of if the borrowing capability was turned back on, then the initial amount that we would be able to borrow was around $3 billion. Now, one thing I want to clarify, that's $3 billion kind of one time. It's not $3 billion every year, right? It's $3 billion. And then next year, that might be a much smaller amount. And the debt would be outstanding for up to 30 years. And so then we would begin to pay it off over time. And so I think that's a question for policymakers, and the way I've tried to simplify it is, and I know I can complicate anything, or at least I'm told I can. With more money, we'll build and maintain more highways, right? And with less money, we'll build and maintain less. And so that's really a question for the policymakers. Are we doing as much as you would expect us to do as your Department of Transportation? If you want us to be doing more, then we're likely going to need more funding. So if you want us to be doing more, then this may be an opportunity for them to debate and consider throughout the remainder of the session.
Right. It's very helpful. Thank you for that. And I know a lot of these they've just hit literally like 1 a.m, I think yesterday or something. So everybody's kind of scurrying and going, okay, like reading between the lines and what does this really mean? And so really appreciate your analysis of that. The other one I have, and this might be slightly more controversial, I'm not sure. But we looked at the budget bills, right? Senate Bill 1, HB 1. There is a rider in there, Rider 47, that does divert some money to TERP. And I know can't advocate one way or the other, but if you can just kind of lay out what that means as it relates to TxDOT.
So I can really geek out on this one.
Great.
So this provision actually relates to the Mobility Fund. And the provision has been in place for back before 2010. So I think maybe around 2008 or 9. So when you go back to 2003 and the legislature started laying out these revenues to come to the Mobility Fund, there was a fee, certificate of title fee, that had been going to TERP. But at that point, TERP was scheduled to end, I think, in 2008. So they said, okay, we'll just continue to assess this fee, but starting in 2009, we'll direct it to the Mobility Fund. So they did that. We went out and issued bonds backed by those future revenues. Then in a subsequent session, somebody said, hey, we need to extend TERP. And we want to continue this funding coming into TERP. Of course, we showed up and said, whoop, we've already pledged that to debt. Can't do that. So they came up with a mechanism that whatever money was deposited to the mobility fund under certificate of title fees, the non-dedicated portion of the highway fund would transfer an equal amount over to TERP. So it would be held harmless. Now, initially that was put in for 2 years, and then it got extended to 6, and then it got extended to 10. And last session, it kind of got extended somewhat in perpetuity. The geeky or wonky part of this is another part of the legislation last session is they moved TERP, which is the Texas Emissions Reduction Plan, outside of the state treasury, right? So it's going to be in a fund outside of the state treasury. Well, when TERP was in the state treasury and you moved money from the highway fund to TERP, that's like an interfund, transfer. It doesn't require appropriation.
Right.
But once you want to send money outside the treasury, you have to have an appropriation. And that's why, for the first time, really, since this has been in place for 10 plus years, you actually have some visibility into it in the budget. One of the things that's been challenging for us, and I highlighted the non-dedicated portion of the highway fund. Most of the revenue to that highway fund, big surprise, must be spent on highways.
Right.
Hence the name. Well, we also do aviation, rail, public transportation, and waterway. And a lot of the funding for that comes out of the non-dedicated portion of the highway fund.
Right.
Well, as these certificate of title fees have increased, that money comes in as non-dedicated, but a larger and larger share of it gets transferred over to TERP, leaving less and less for us to direct for these other modes of transportation.
Okay.
So that something.
I think that's the key. I mean, I think that's just kind of that captures.
Yeah.
It kind of handcuffs a little bit more. Maybe I don't know if that's the right word, but it's just it's a different pot, and it takes from that pot that really could free up some flexibility. So that makes sense.
And so what that does in our appropriations request, and sorry to go on maybe, is in the appropriations request, there's an exceptional item request where if you look at Textile, a lot of our exceptional item requests are for rail, aviation, public transportation. And that's because we don't have any eligible money left available to us. So the process kind of requires us to go in and ask for general revenue for those additional needs.
Right. Thank you. And this is why I always say transportation funding is the most difficult thing to communicate, because you can't put it in a soundbite. But it is fascinating, and it's worth the conversation. So really appreciate you walking us through all of that. There's some other questions, so I don't want everyone to want to hear me talk the whole time. So I know Barry Goodman had a question. Barry, are you still available? I know you were the first one. If you're on, please.
I unmuted. I am available.
Okay, great.
And I appreciate the time that Executive Director Bass is spending with us. I've always been interested in innovative, creative financing when it comes to mobility, and I've had discussions with Mr. Bass from time to time on how to increase that flexibility. I'm sure he remembers a few of those. I've got two areas that I'm still interested in. One is the state does still have a state infrastructure bank, correct?
Correct.
And is it also correct that bank is there to fund, subject to various things, but to allow local political subdivisions to borrow money for capital mobility infrastructure?
Yes. Now, primarily, again, it's for, generally speaking, highway projects, because when it was initially capitalized, it was capitalized with dedicated funds from the state highway fund and also federal highway dollars. And so that's kind of, those limitations have continued on with that program as it's continued.
Well, I was asking the question from the perspective of the public transit side of the equation. If we have a public transit facility that is for maintenance, but also emergency management related to hurricane evacuation. I've got a specific example of one we've recently completed in Texas City. And Texas City has been designated by the governor as an emergency center for receipt and distribution of evacuees from mainly Galveston, Brazoria County. My question was really exploring whether we could borrow money from the SIB, State Infrastructure Bank, to begin construction of that facility in advance of the availability of federal funding. So that's why I asked the question.
Yeah, so I think because of the dollars that went in to capitalize the State Infrastructure Bank, my initial response, and don't take this as official answer, right? My initial response would be, I don't think so. I think the legislation for the State Infrastructure Bank actually talks about having an account for public transportation, but it's never been capitalized because nobody ever wanted to direct some of the FTA funds into that program. We do have, and we just spoke about the mobility fund. The mobility fund is more flexible than the highway fund. And yes, the mobility fund can be used on highways, but it can also be used for other public transportation projects. And those air quotes of other public transportation does not mean public transit. You know, it just means moving people. So it's not available for freight projects, but it's available to move people. And so that mobility fund, you know, could potentially be a source should the legislature decide to act on that.
Yeah, we have many examples I can give you of need for transit vehicles, for example, in advance of when federal funding might be available. And so the opportunity to borrow money at an attractive interest rate comes into play. But this also leads to another question that I've posed that's been very difficult to answer. The Federal Transit Administration has guidelines that enable you to get advanced pre-award authority to spend local money in advance of the availability of federal funds. Now you have to prove up the project. So you have to prove it's in the TIP, in the STIP, that you've done environmental. But it's been impossible to get that done because the Textile does not have that same type of advanced pre-award authority. And I know you don't have necessarily answers to this, but it's something that I want to work on, because as we grow in particularly the Houston-Galveston area, and one of the things we talked to many legislative reps about was, how can we have more flexibility locally to vote locally to increase taxes to support mobility, not just public transit, but mobility. And we've gotten a number of positive responses to that, but I would say for the most part, the response has been, you know, we've got a lot to deal with this session. We've got, and you've got, you know, the pandemic, and you've got one disaster or another, and you've got not much time left. But it seems that there's always, if there can be a way to opt to not doing something, that is it. And I've never understood in a state like Texas, which I came here in 1970, I shouldn't even, 4, and Texas was a pay-as-you-go state. And democracy was at the top of the list. And I've never fully understood why asking the legislature to enable the ability of local communities to either increase their registration fees, $5, or do other things like that, if the vote of the people supports it, why that has created such a chilling effect in the legislature. And that's sort of the feeling I get some of the time, that it's sort of a paradox. It's not logical from my viewpoint.
So I think there may have actually been some bills filed recently about the ability for optional registration fees, some subject to voter approval, some perhaps not. One thing on this pre-award activity on transit, I just want to make sure that I'm following, because I'm thinking of a parallel on the highway side. So would this be where a local entity, a local or state entity would spend their funding, and then maybe a year or two later, they would then seek federal reimbursement on those earlier expenses?
Exactly. And in the federal, in the FTA context, Federal Transit Administration, they have what's called a letter of no prejudice, which sort of gives you a 5-year window to seek funding. But it's been very difficult. And I think my sense is Eric Gleason, he's terrific, by the way. He's great. It is fully supportive, but when the lawyers get together and talk about this, it's all, there's always a reason why, and we get a lot of funding through TxDOT, other than the big metros, that all goes through TxDOT. So there seems to be this.
So we'll circle with Eric and even some of those attorneys. So because on the highway side, on federal highways, the process they refer to it as is advanced construction.
Mm-hmm.
And so this sounds like a very similar process, and we are able to utilize that advanced construction on the highway side. So I'll visit with Eric and with our attorneys to see if there's a way that we could not avail ourselves of that, similar opportunities in the transit arena.
All right, I appreciate your time very much, and I'm looking forward to further discussion on this.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Bye.
Thanks, Barry. I know our question from Larry Bueller, City of Alvin. Larry?
Thanks, Andrea, and thank you, Executive Director Bass, for all
Your voice sounds very familiar.
Oh, wow. I might have been in front of you earlier today.
Oh yeah, yes,
At
yes.
the commission. Yes. Quick question for you. What are your thoughts on regional collaborations, specifically on the Houston region? You've seen a lot across the great state of Texas. And again, the example could be the completion of the Grand Parkway system. But so the question would follow up with are the right messages getting to the right people as a collaborative group from our Houston region, and your thoughts on that?
I think the messages are good. They may be it may be a different audience. I'm not sure if I'm saying this right. So as you well know, the direction we as TxDOT have been given, and I think even the direction our commission has been given, is to operate in a non-toll environment. And so I think if you look to the policymakers, which would include the legislature and the leadership, that could be an area to have that discussion in, as opposed to and I know you're not doing this, rather than coming to me and say, James, how can we do this? Like, well, I'm going to follow the direction of the policymakers, right? And so if you want to change a policy, don't talk to the implementer, talk to the policymakers.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's one of the things that we've seen, especially through TAG and their different legislative series that they've been doing, Bay Area Transportation Partnership as well. We're hearing from Senator Nichols, from the chairman of the transportation, and we're hearing from Representative Thompson on the House side, and they're in favor of those things. So we're trying to do that at the same time. So we definitely understand it is those policymakers and leadership that we need to carry our message to. So thank you for your thoughts. We appreciate all you're doing.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Mayor Joe Zimmerman, Mayor Sugarland, I know he had a question for you. Mayor?
Yeah, James, first of all, thanks for your service to TxDOT. My question's a little bit different. What do you view as the biggest, realize that the legislature meets every other year. What do you think the biggest challenges are, 2 or 3 for TxDOT over the next, say, 2 to 5 years? Not budget related. I realize the budget's always a challenge.
Yeah, so it kind of relates to the budget, but I'm thinking, again, I apologize that I'll try not to address it, and then I'll address it if that makes sense. So some of it I think is IT, and right, we were subject to a ransomware attack last year, and our group, responded tremendously, and we, really didn't miss much of a step. We still awarded contracts that month. We got payments out to contractors that month. We paid all of our employees. And so we really responded well, but kind of increasing that cybersecurity, that exterior facing and making sure that we can hold off any future attacks, increasing the infrastructure in the IT world to help us be more efficient, right? The old saying is, work smarter, not harder. Well, IT can help us do that. So making sure that we're making those investments going forward. I'm reminded, and it's maybe a little bit longer term than what your question was, but we had our transportation forum. Thank you for being a part of that, Andrea, with Chairman Canales. But in one of my interviews, that they asked me, in a perfect world, well, what would you change or whatever? And I talked about it a little bit on the state highway fund, and that money is limited to highways. But I think longer term, again, a question for the policymakers, if our population is going to almost double between now and 2050, does your Department of Transportation need to do more than just highways? Does the funding eligibility need to potentially be looked at and possibly expanded? Maybe yes, maybe no, but it's obviously served us well over the decades in the past. I think it's just a question to be looked at maybe going forward. Should the modes that TxDOT can really invest in, should those be looked at and discussed and potentially expanded, or continue on for a while?
Thank you, James.
Thank you, Mayor. I know Darren Willer was on. He had a question. I'm not sure if he's still. Darren, can you unmute?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, James.
Hey, Darren.
Not driving. He's
Congratulations.
Hey, he's parked.
Well,
parked.
I'm sitting, so I am not driving.
Okay.
Congratulations on your new role. But the question I had, it was similar to what Mayor Zimmerman is, with TxDOT's inability to really fund transit, and RMAs have that ability. Do you see them playing a bigger role in the state going forward with the new administration's focus on that area?
Yeah, and I think the new federal administration really seems to be focused on that. One of the challenges from an RMA standpoint would be, well, what's the revenue source to fund it? If it's federal dollars, most of our large metros already have transit authorities. They receive their funding directly from FTA and go forward. But I think there might be opportunities for partnerships, and maybe it might not so much be on the transit side of itself, but that integration between different modes to make it more seamless. If somebody's going to transition from one mode to the other, I think there may be opportunities for collaboration and those efforts.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Congratulations. I look forward to working with you. New role.
Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Darren. So we had a question about the safety funding that was set aside that may go away. Obviously, want to better understand that, safety is very important. And so can you walk us through that that decision or that thought process to setting aside that funding?
Yeah, and so a couple of years ago, through this UTP process, again, our 10-year planning document, the commission at the time decided, and I think Chairman Bugg used a term today that I thought was appropriate, kind of surge funding. So kind of a one-time funding, one-time shot in the arm of additional $600 million to be directed towards safety enhancements along the system. And that $600 million was put in, $300 million in year one, $300 million in year two. Well, now we're stepping into year three coming up. And so there was a question, well, does that continue? Does it not continue? And I think part of the question is, I think the commission wanted to see the value of that investment for the $600 600 million, that initial surge funding. A lot of those projects haven't been completed yet, so we don't have a lot of metrics to show for it. At the same time, within the UTP over this 10-year period, I think there's around 3.4 billion in a safety category, right? And so one of the things that Chairman Bugg just asked us earlier today as staff was to look at that. I almost said category 8, like anybody would know what that means, but category 8 safety funding in the UTP, and look at, are there ways to leverage that and maybe blend it in with additional funding? Because historically, the category 8 funding has been more, I'm not sure if siloed is the right word, but it's kind of been for, smaller scale improvements, and it hasn't necessarily gone in with other funding on larger scale projects that include safety enhancements. The other thing that we've started highlighting, we are a strong believer that anytime we go in and make an improvement to the roadway, it includes safety improvements. So even if we're not using quote unquote safety funds, we still think by going in and doing improvements to a roadway, we're enhancing the safety of that roadway. And so we've started reporting as we present these contract awards to the commission each month, what our estimate of those investments in the safety arena are that aren't even coming from the safety category, if you will.
Okay, thank you. I know Dr. Carol Lewis had a follow-up to Darren's question. Dr. Lewis, I didn't catch it quick enough, so did you want to jump on?
No, you caught it. Hello, Director Bass. No, I
Hi.
was clicking it in as Darren was asking, but obviously glad to have you. Appreciate your position, and I've been listening, not asking any questions because, as you say, the policy is directed, by the commission. But after Darren asked that question, I wanted to kind of follow up and say that in work I'm doing, I'm a professor at Texas Southern University, so I do a lot of research. And in work I'm doing, we really see a need for rural and sort of ex-urbans to be connected into the urbans by public transportation. Let me give you a real specific example. I chair Gulf Coast Rail District. And so, we've got about, 5, 6 counties down here. And so we want to do some kind of high capacity transit up to 90, up the right of way. And our jurisdiction takes us all the way through Waller County. Well, Cap Metro has the first 50 miles going south on 290. There's about 50 miles in the middle to connect us. And I've got this vision of having some kind of high capacity transit way that we can get from Houston to Austin. The 50 miles between us has to be done by Textile. So, and in work I've done, I've seen lots that, a lot of this sort of rural ex-urban connecting into urbans, not just here, but between here and Dallas or here in San Antonio. I mean, we could go all over the state probably and give examples. But I just kind of wanted to get a kind of a feel from you about that and about TxDOT's sort of potential or window to actually come in and fill in voids like that.
So I have a question for you maybe, so on this high capacity, are you talking like a transit line, or is it more like a dedicated bus lane on the freeway, or either or?
So exactly. Undesignated. We've been talking about commuter rail, but as we sort of move forward, into the future, I mean, it could be something automated. I mean, I sort of got in my brain that we could do an automated bus in a right of way like that. Or you could even do both. You could have, light rail if Cap Metro does light rail on their, portion. You could, in that right of way, still run an automated vehicle on top of those tracks, an automated bus. It doesn't have to all be the same.
So on the transit side of it, so with Cap Metro here in Austin, they recently upgraded the transit station down here by the convention center. Many people don't realize that the commission awarded a grant. I think it was a 50 million, may have been 20. I think it was 50 from the mobility fund that we talked about earlier for that project. And then if you go even farther back in time, probably back in 2008 or so, the Denton County Transit Authority wanted to make a connection into DART, and the commission had a grant in excess of 200 million, again, from the mobility fund to the Denton County Transit Authority to help. I think it may have been for the cars, to be able to make that connection to start. So I think there's been a couple examples where the department and the commission have partnered with locals to make that happen. The two that initially come to mind were funded by the Texas Mobility Fund. And some of that gets back to the, within TxDOT, we oftentimes talk about the color of money, because, if I have $1 of the highway fund and I have $1 out of the mobility fund, I can't spend them on the same thing. Some of them,
Right.
Some things could be spent on the same, but other opportunities may
Right.
exist. $1 may be more flexible than the other.
For sure. All right, but so anyway, just I can keep my mind open about that, huh? Keep
Yeah,
my
and
vision going.
Yeah, and if you haven't, and hopefully Eric Gleason, and if not, I would welcome, to reach out and get in contact with him, and then he can kind of keep us at TxDOT
Right.
engaged in that discussion going forward.
So, and I would also love a TxDOT. Is Eric Gleason, is he in your TxDOT rail division? Is that where he
Well,
is?
so he is our public transportation division. So we do
Okay.
small urban and rural grants, and
Okay.
then so our rail is Peter Espy. But from your description, I think it
Right.
might be more Eric Gleason.
Right.
Yeah.
And Peter's the one that I've talked to in the
Okay.
past. I don't think I've met Eric, but I am
Okay.
jotting down an old-fashioned way his name with a pen.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. We have another question. Just got to talk about I-45. It's a big issue here. So Jeff Collins, did you want to ask your question?
Well, I asked that we need to talk about I-45. And I know that's a big, everybody, a lot of opinions either way. I guess.
Is there some controversy that I'm not aware of?
Well, perhaps. I think I saw Eliza on there earlier. Maybe she can fill you in. But kind of tell me from, I know somewhat Eliza's perspective. She's here every day. Let me hear your perspective of the executive director of TxDOT, and what is our next step, and then just your perspective on this ongoing discussion.
So, one, I think the ongoing discussion is healthy, right? It kind of points out, again, this is my perspective from 180 to 200 miles away, right? But so we work with HGAC, right? And they say this is the project definition and this is the project scope that we want TxDOT to work on. And so the HGAC takes a vote and we TxDOT go start to work on it. Through the environmental process, some of those votes may have happened 15, 16 years ago. So big surprise, priorities may change, they may not change, but they certainly could change over that time period. And now we're coming, towards the end of that cycle and coming forward. And there are some voices in the region who may not be supportive of the regionally approved project. So it wasn't approved unanimously, and many of our projects across the state are not unanimous, right? And so then there's a discussion on whether or not that project perhaps needs to be redefined or refined. And there's a distinction there, right, between redefinition and refinement. And I think our point is, if the region or if somebody in the region wants to redefine the project, there is a process for doing that, and that goes back through the MPO. And so we would go back through the MPO and say, hey, we want to redefine this project, and we want to look at it as a region and work towards perhaps a new vision for this project. Again, we think there's a process in place, and we think that goes through the MPO. And so, we're continuing on the path until such time as the MPO may say, now we want to pause, or we want to think about it, or we want to change the vision of the project. We're going to continue to work on that. And again, those other voices in the community who have different thoughts, I think that's great. And we want to work with them, and we want to work on refining the project, not redefining, refining the project to make it as beneficial for as many folks as possible. But if we cross over that redefinition or redefining line, then we think that the appropriate process to do that is working with the NPO.
Okay, thanks. I know our region wants that project or some sort of project there. We need safety improvements. We need to improve the capacity, whether that be on the automobile side or on the transit side. We do want that project, and I want to really appreciate what Eliza and the district has done to listen to folks and get their input.
Yeah, and this may be, maybe I should just leave it at this, but I won't. So I think there's a question, and this in no way is meant to be a threat of any way, shape, or form. It's just kind of a definition of the process, right? So on the current project, some of that funding came from HGAC and some came from the commission. And the commission voted to give that money for a specific defined process and project. Well, if that project definition changes, we think that money comes back to the commission, because the commission did not grant it to the Houston region for whatever they want, just like they didn't grant money to Austin for whatever they want, or to Dallas-Fort Worth for whatever they want. They do it project specific. And so if you go through that process, then yep, that money would come back and the commission would consider it. And perhaps a bad analogy, but I'll use it anyway. And I don't think it's offensive. I hope it's not offensive to anybody. But let's say that we have a child that's going to graduate college. And we as a parent say, you know what, congratulations. Here's $15,000 to help you buy a new car, because we want you to have a reliable transportation as you begin your work, your career and the work path. We want you to have reliable transportation. So we choose to, and I realize even using a car may not be, I may have just upset some people by saying that, but so we say we're going to give you $15,000 for a vehicle. Well, Junior comes back a week later and says, you know what, I really appreciate the $15,000, but I've decided I'm going to take a year off and I'm going to travel through Europe, and that $15,000 is going to come in quite handy. I think mom and dad would say, whoa, 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 that's not what I gave you the $15,000 for, and that $15,000 is coming back. Again, perhaps a poor analogy, but when the commission grants money on a specific project and a specific definition, if that project changes, if it gets redefined, then I think we would need to circle back with the commission to say, hey, this is now a different project from what you initially voted on. Just like we would go back to the MPO and say, this is a different project than what you allocated money to. Do you still want to allocate money to this new project? Well, the same would hold true for the commission as well. And that's the thought behind, I think, some of the comments that I've asked Eliza to make. They may have been misinterpreted, or that somebody was trying to play hardball. That's untrue, right? We're just trying to live up to the process that's put in place.
Well, I'm going to leave by 45 minutes.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, James, for walking through that. I think these are hard conversations to have. And so, but to not talk about it is not helpful either. So, so thank you for that. I know we're running a little over time. We had one more question. I think it's a great one to close with. Raj, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Andrea. Director Bass, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it every single time. And thank you for your leadership and congrats on your new role. Good luck with everything. So quick question, and it's a little bit of a crystal ball question, so forgive me for that, with all these external factors and everything going on. But I just wanted to ask, it's more of a statewide question. So from your perspective, do you expect the project fundings to come back to a sense of normalcy at some point? And if so, what kind of a time frame are we looking at?
So if I can ask you maybe to define a little bit, what do you mean by the project funding?
Like specifically TechStart projects and your procurement budgets and allocations that have been scaled back a little bit.
Yeah, and so on the engineering side, you know, when we got Prop 1 and Prop 7 a few years ago, our 10-year planning document, I think, was somewhere around 35 billion, 32 to 35 billion. And then I'll somewhat joke, we woke up one morning and it's 75 billion, right? So we needed to start sprinting with our partners to get projects developed to utilize that funding. I think one of the things that happened is we started sprinting and we didn't all realize that, well, wait, at some point we're gonna have to steady out that pace. We can't continue to climb that mountain and, you know, year after year after year kind of keep spending more and more. At some point we're going to start to plateau. And I think we've reached that plateau, and it appears to be maybe around $1 billion a year, you know, through partners on the engineering side of that. Now, some of this is, I was going to say equal parts, but it might not be equal parts, but some of it's science and art, right? It's kind of like, okay, well, how much do we need to commit to on the engineering side to make sure we have projects ready to go? And one of the things I've said over the years, we would, you know, perfect world, which we don't live in, man, as soon as the project was ready, we would, you know, we'd be able to move forward and fund it because dollars would be coming in at that exact moment. But because we live in an imperfect world, our choice really is we either have projects waiting on funding or we have funding waiting on projects. And given that choice, we would rather have projects waiting on the funding within some reason, right? We don't want 4 years worth of projects sitting on the shelves because then we've spent way too much money on development when we could have been using some of that money to build it. So I apologize, this is a very long answer and winding around, but I think that target going forward is going to kind of be in that $1 billion range for engineering firms that we partner with. I think, you know, a couple of years from now, the department will need to revisit that, and it may be slightly more, it could be slightly less, but I think for this kind of near-term vision that we see it kind of being around that $1 billion a year area.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Raj. And I didn't mention, but there's a lot of other bills that we could have talked about as well. But one that in particular, I think it really kind of captures a lot of this conversation, specifically with the question that Raj just asked, is Chairman Canalis's study bill for 2045 to kind of reassess where TxDOT and transportation funding is. We had the 2030 Commission. That's how really Prop 1 and Prop 7 were born. And so I think this is a great piece of legislation to really capture where we really are with funding and where the need really is and kind of moving forward. So more on that. I look forward to continued conversations with you and all of the TxDOT team. You all have been great and really appreciate it. And I'm really pleased that you're gonna finish the session, the regular session, with us. And I'm thinking we might be able to get you back at least one more time. I'm sure there'll be something to talk about as we move through the session. So thank you so much for your time today. And I know there's a couple of things that some folks on here might want to follow up with you about. And so we'll definitely stay close to that.
All right. And, sounds great.
Yeah. So everybody have a great rest of the day. Stay safe. And let's see here. AJ is saying something. No, he's asking if you want to stay around for a redistricting conversation. I don't.
I think I'll pass on that one.
I don't think so, AJ. So with that, we thank you again so much, and we look forward to continued conversations. And we'll talk soon.
All right. Thank you all.